All right, good evening, everybody. Hello. Hello. I'm Sarah. I'm a program manager here. I want to welcome you all to our lecture tonight on plant exploration then and now. I'm here to introduce our two wonderful speakers tonight. The Arboretum has a long history of collecting seeds and cuttings from around the world to grow here as part of our collections. So tonight, our two speakers are going to talk about what collecting was like back then and what it's like now. There's some similarities, there's a lot of differences. So our first speaker is the head of Library and Archives, Lisa Pearson. And our second is the keeper of Living Collections, Michael Dosmann. Now, Lisa Pearson is, I'm going to lower this because I'm very short. Lisa Pearson is a graduate of the Library Science program at Simmons University. She started at the Arboretum Library as an image cataloger, which allowed her to become deeply familiar with our photograph collection. Later, she managed our journal collection before becoming the head of the Library and Archives in 2012. She's a regular contributor to Arboretum publications and the Arboretum website, and is delighted to lecture on Arboretum history both online and in person. Now, our second speaker, Michael Dosmann, is, like I said, the keeper of the Living Collections at the Arnold Arboretum, where he curates one of the Earth's most important collections of temperate woody plants. Among the hats he wears are horticulturalist, scientist, writer, lecturer, and plant explorer. As a plant explorer, Michael has conducted some 15 plant collecting expeditions in East Asia and North America, many of which focused on plants threatened with extinction. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Lisa.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. All right, plant exploration then. So nearly 10 years ago, we began to ask ourselves, how many plant expeditions have we conducted at the Arnold Arboretum since our founding in 1872? So you might think that's a seemingly simple question, but it further caused us to ask ourselves, what exactly was an expedition? And after a good deal of research and brainstorming, we came to define 4 types of germplasm collecting activities that fall under the broad umbrella of expedition. So the first is, as you might expect, an Arboretum-sponsored expedition with the Arboretum staff participating and with a planned objective to collect living or preserved plant specimens. The next is a non-Arboretum expedition, and this is a sort of expedition where we are not the sponsors, or have staff participating in them, but from which we receive plant material, either living or preserved, that's added to our collections. The third type of expedition that we have is the contracted collection. And this is a sort of expedition where we have determined the objective and we've paid an outside collector, but Arboretum staff did not participate in the collecting. The final sort of collecting expedition that we have is called a campaign. And it has more than one discrete start and end date, and yet the objectives, such as the location or the taxa, has remained consistent over time. By, let me see here. Oh, there we are. By defining these categories, we were then able to examine all of our collecting events over the decades and discover that we had conducted 80 Arboretum expeditions, had 16 contract collections, and engaged in 10 collecting campaigns, and also had been participating with 11 non-Arboretum expeditions. We gathered all this information together in the plant exploration page on our website and the section called Expeditions Unveiled. And I encourage you, when you have a chance, to take a look at it. You can learn more about our long history of exploration and read some in-depth stories about our particular expeditions. So our first collecting event was contracted collections that were made by William S. Clark in Japan as early as 1876 and 1877. Clark had gone to Japan from the Massachusetts Agricultural College, which is now UMass Amherst, at the invitation of the Meiji government to help found an agricultural college in Sapporo in Hokkaido province, an institution that is now Hokkaido University. 3 trees still grow on the grounds from the seed that he collected in Hokkaido there so long ago. two katsura trees, and you see one of them there on the left-hand side of the picture. They're along Meadow Road. And then the magnificent Japanese tree lilac that greets visitors at the foot of the lilac collection on Bussey Hill Road. And you see it in bloom there on the right. Our first Arboretum plant collector was our founding director, the indomitable Charles Sprague Sargent. He was born here to an old Boston family and graduated from Harvard College in 1862. Like so many of his classmates, he served in the Civil War and was breveted a major by the end of the conflict. From 1865 to 1868, he toured the gardens of Europe, and that photo there on the left dates from that trip. And then he returned to Boston to manage his father's estate in Brookline. The Home Lee was the estate. He was appointed director of the Arboretum in 1873, still a very young man, and guided our institution with a firm hand, dare I say an iron hand sometimes, until his death 54 years later. During those years, he oversaw the design and building of our landscape with Frederick Law Olmsted, directed a census of the trees of North America, conducted the publication of Garden and Forest, traveled the world, created a Silva of North America in 14 volumes, as well as a manual of trees. He engaged collectors to bring back thousands of plants to grow at the Arboretum, but he himself led the way as early as the 1870s. He collected then in the territories of the American West. We see him here with two of his collecting partners, Francis Skinner, the tall man standing, and then George Engelmann in a triple portrait from that time period. He also had his collecting take him to the southeastern states and into the Caribbean. And he journeyed in 1892 to Japan to see for himself the botanical diversity. It has great genetic diversity too, hinted at by William Clark's collections a decade and a half earlier. Later, in 1903, he and his son Andrew and naturalist John Muir set off on a trip around the world, which they visited numerous botanic gardens and private estates in Europe and beyond. During their sojourn in Asia, Sargent finally got to see a bit of the Chinese flora for himself. He was entranced. I'll leave Sargent for a moment here and go over to John George Jack. So Jack was a long-serving member of our Arboretum staff who had dedicated himself to education and plant exploration. He was a pioneer in visitor education, leading the first field classes for visitors and teachers on the grounds. He was a Harvard College lecturer in arboriculture and later assistant professor of dendrology. He was also an experienced plant explorer when he embarked on his trip to Asia in 1905. He had extensively explored in the American West, Pikes Peak, and various places. And if you have a dwarf Alberta spruce in your yard, well, you can thank John Jack for that, because he and Alfred Rader discovered that particular plant. In Asia, he collected in Japan, Korea, and China as far as the political situation would allow in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War. In Sargent's 1904 to 1905 annual report to the president of Harvard, he states that, and I quote, "Mr. J.G. Jack has started on a journey to the east to obtain material for the Arboretum in Japan, Korea, and northern China." And of course, that would imply that the Arboretum paid for his journey. However, his trip was self-financed, and his regular pay was suspended during his leave of absence, much to Jack's annoyance. He likely planned his trip in part to spend some time with his brother Milton, who was a missionary that was stationed in Taiwan, but he also made valuable connections with Japanese botanists such as Professor Kingo Miyabi from, where else, the Sapporo Agricultural College. In light of all the specimens in the germplasm he collected, Sargent relented and reinstated Jack's pay for the 6 months that he was in Asia. And in this slide, we see from left to right Jack in a formal portrait from 1904, and then a photo taken in Japan by Jack of Professor Kingo Miyabi, and a snapshot of Jack conducting a field class in the Hickory collection from about the same time period. So met with a vast variety of material brought back from Asia, it's unsurprising then that in 1906, Sargent decided to cajole Ernest Henry Wilson, who was a seasoned explorer who had already made 2 trips to China for the Veitch Nursery Company to collect for the Arnold Arboretum. Initially, Wilson was firm against venturing off again to Asia. It was unsurprising. He had a very young family, and when you read between the lines, Mrs. Wilson, the lady standing there in the far left, was dead set against it. And it took Sargent in Boston and plantswoman Ellen Wilmot in England the better part of the summer to change Wilson's mind. But by November of that year, he had agreed to make another trip, with the understanding that he would travel first class and receive sufficient remuneration to comfortably keep his wife and baby daughter during his absence, and with a little extra to put away for their savings. In the slide, we see young Wilson there on the right, and then we see a somewhat later portrait taken in 1914 of the Wilson family with his wife Ellen and daughter Muriel Primrose. Let's see here. There we go. So a thing to understand about expeditions such as Wilson's was that they were exactly that. They were real expeditions. And unlike today, and Michael will elaborate further on this, when we can, hop on a plane and be to China in about 24 hours or so, Wilson had a long journey just to get to his destination. For his 1907 to 1909 trip, notice 1907 to 1909, 3 years in country, he left on December 5th, 1906 from Liverpool, England on the White Star liner RMS Baltic and arrived in New York 9 days later on December 14th. After a detour to Boston to check in with Sargent and complete all the final preparations and things that needed to be done, he was off across the continent by rail on Sunday, December 30th. He described the winter landscape that he passed through as dreary from a scenic point of view, but the trip was not without some excitement. Of course, perhaps not the excitement that he would have hoped for. Their engines, tender luggage, and dining cars were smashed when the train collided with a switch engine around Omaha, Nebraska, and it delayed the trip by 10 hours until they could get some replacements in. Wilson arrived in California having heard about the devastation in San Francisco in the wake of the April 1906 earthquake and decided it was more prudent to stay in Oakland until his ship, the Doric, was ready to sail on January 8th. The first stop on the long journey across the Pacific Ocean was in Honolulu, and he had enough of a layover there that he stopped to call upon William Tufts Brigham, who was the curator of the Bernice P. Bishop Museum there. His next port of call was in Yokohama, Japan on January 28th. That was a day and a half late due to heavy seas. And his ship appears to have made calls at several other Japanese ports, laying over for short periods of time. Enough time for Wilson to call upon Dr. Bunzo Hayata, who was an expert in the Taiwanese flora, and cytologist Dr. Kenjiro Fujii, and also to make a visit to the Louis Bohm Nursery in Yokohama. Now on this slide, we see on the left of the picture there a picture postcard of the Baltic docked at its Liverpool dock. And on the right here, and let me just point out, wait a minute. Right here, this is the Doric. Now you notice this ship still has masts. It was a steamship, but it also had masts, and it was a little on the old side when Wilson sailed on it. He remarks to Sargent that it was kind of as bad as Sargent thought it was. I think Sargent had sailed on the ship previously, and neither were particularly impressed by the quality. The ship was actually sank several years later. At the bottom is a photo, and it's a little small, and I apologize about that. That is a panorama shot of the devastation in San Francisco taken in May of 1906. It was huge. There was earthquake, but then there was a firestorm, and the city was just destroyed. That's really quite something. And Wilson actually made a journey over to San Francisco just to see the devastation himself, and he said it was catastrophic. So, China at last. On February 4th, Wilson finally reached China when his ship docked in Shanghai after what he calls a monotonous journey of 3.5 weeks across the Pacific. 3.5 weeks to go across the ocean. Think about that. He set about making arrangements for forwarding his mail and other papers, and he departed for Hankow, which is modern-day Wuhan, on the evening of February 17th, and finally arrived in Yichang, his base for much of his time in China, on February 26th. Now, consider for a moment that that's nearly 12 weeks since he first left England in December, so it just took so long to get to the place he was going to. He sprang into action and had soon purchased a houseboat, which you see there, to accommodate himself and his men. And word of his return had reached Yichang before Wilson's arrival, and he writes that one of his old assistants was waiting for him on the gangplank when the ship docked at the city. More of his assistants soon arrived, and Wilson remarks that he'll have no difficulty hiring as many men as he needed for his expedition. So in the slide, we see Wilson and his team, and they're here. Wilson is that man there. And if you notice the man, it's a little bit difficult to see, but right there with a light-colored cloth cap on, that's Frank Zappi. He was along collecting ornithological specimens for the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. When traveling in China, Wilson was required to carry governmental or consular-issued passports and permits to provide safe passage for himself and his assistants during their explorations. There were large documents. The one on the left is one of the permits, about 11 by 17, and with the text usually in script on Chinese fiber paper. Many of the documents have added notations in English, with some in Wilson's own hand, and Wilson's own horrible, illegible handwriting. And he also had calling cards made up. You see one there on the left, with his name phonetically rendered in Chinese characters. On his March 18th letter to Sargent, Wilson mentions that his passport had arrived from Beijing and adds that he needs now only to get his bed, his bedding, and his photographic plates. Now, the image on the left-hand side, that's actually a permit that was to allow Wilson and Frank Zappi to carry firearms and cartridges for the firearms, ammunition for the firearms. So, on to those photographic plates. So, Sargent was adamant that Wilson photographed during his expedition, and he considered those photographs to be as much scientific documents as the herbarium vouchers Wilson collected and the field notes he composed along the way. In a November 6, 1906 letter, Sargent says, "I write again to remind you of the very great importance of the photograph business on your new journey. A good set of photographs are really about as important as anything you can bring back with you. I hope, therefore, that you will not fail to provide yourself with the very best instrument you can, irrespective of cost. And it ought to be large enough to take pictures 8.5 by 6.5 inches, and it ought to get a stout leather case with which to have it carried. Bring, too, enough plates and films, as there will certainly be a large amount of material to photograph." Wilson responded later in the month saying, "I took the camera business in hand and sought professional advice and have had a Sanderson camera of the latest and best type made to order. This type is considered best for tree subjects, possessing as it does the greatest rise and fall of front." So this is a Sanderson camera here. It's not Wilson Sanderson. That's long since been lost to time. Boy, I wish we had it. And I also wish that we had a photograph of him with his camera, because then we could tell what sort of Sanderson camera he actually purchased. But I suspect, though, that seeing as Sargent specified buying the best possible instrument, and that the Arboretum was paying for it, that Wilson probably sprang for a Sanderson tropical camera, or perhaps, if he was feeling very flush, a tropical deluxe, similar to the camera in the photo. They were constructed of weather-resistant teakwood, and they had many brass reinforcements on the corners and the sides and everything to be heavy-duty. It came with a stout tripod, too, and that tripod would later be pressed into service as a splint for Wilson's leg when it was injured in 1910. In a later letter, Sargent tells Wilson to get some lessons on how to use the apparatus, and I can understand why he might say that. I think this is just about the most polar opposite of a point-and-shoot sort of camera that you could possibly have. And, of course, this was a whole plate camera, too, and what that means is that it used individual, pre-prepared glass plates that measured, as Sargent had specified, 6.5 by 8.5 inches, 165 by 250 millimeters, and were sold in packages of 12. Wilson speaks about shooting X and so number of dozen of packages of photos when he's in the field. It was up to Wilson's porters to carefully carry the heavy packages of plates over hill and dale where he went in China and Eastern Asia. So this brings me to the actual logistics of traveling in the field. And from his bases in Yichang or in Chengdu, Sichuan, he and his team, which included a personal servant who was also his cook, his trained collectors, his porters, they all stepped off on foot. Or should I say that they stepped off on foot with Wilson riding along in a sedan chair, which you see here in the photos, suspended between two bamboo poles. In his book, A Naturalist in Western China, Wilson describes sedan chairs as, and I quote, an outward and visible sign of respectability. It is a recognized medium of travel, and quite apart from its real use, it is a necessity since its presence ensures respect. In out-of-the-way parts of China, even though it's carried piecemeal, a chair is of greater service to the traveler than a passport. And here we see two views of Wilson's sedan chair. The image on the left shows it in the colder months, and on the right in high summer with just a light sunshade over the open sides. But in truth, though, Wilson often walked with his men. In a diary entry for one of his earlier expeditions for Veitch Nursery, he recounts, leaving Tashanlu, and that's present-day Kending, Sichuan, on July 23rd, 1903, and traveling by way of Yaochao, Chengdu, Quanshan, and the Min Valley, I reached the town of Songpan on August 27th, a journey of over 550 miles. When I left Kaiting, and that's the present-day city of Leshan, on June 25th for Tashanlu, I weighed 11 stone 4 pounds. Now that's equivalent to 158 pounds. On arrival in Songpan, I was barely 8 stone 6 pounds. It's 118 pounds. I mentioned this personal detail merely to show how trying and exhausting the journey proved. Now, when you consider that Wilson, he was a tall man. He was 5'10". This weight loss through sheer exertion is it's breathtaking. The slide shows Wilson's team on July 9th, 1908. The caption says, caravan and gear which crossed from Quanshan to Tashanlu via the tribe's country, a distance of 330 miles. And if you notice, most of them have just little, very lightweight fiber sandals on. It's really something. So once they got to places they needed to get to, now they were in accommodations. And unlike Arboretum plant collector Joseph Rock, who explored for us in Gansu province in the 1920s, and who provided himself with the very best tents from Abercrombie and Fitch had to offer, Wilson didn't camp out along the way in tents. Instead, he and his men progressed from hostel to hostel along the way. These rough accommodations were often dirty, but they were a roof over their heads for the night, at least, even if those roofs were leaky sometimes. And he photographed several. In the upper left is the hostel of Xiaolong Tan, and to the right, the hostel of Che Tse Ko, both near Fangshan. And below is a hand-tinted lantern slide showing the hostel and temple near the summit of Panlanshan. So as I mentioned before, Wilson was accompanied by a group of men that included trained assistants. And I have no doubt that his Chinese expeditions would not have been as successful as they were had it not been for their help. These men, who hailed from Yichang and its environs, had been with Wilson since his first journeys for Veitch Nursery. And they may also, at least some of them, have assisted botanist Augustine Henry in his plant collecting prior to 1900. They continued their association with Wilson during his 2 trips for the Arnold Arboretum. Several of the men were farmers and the remainder townsmen, including a man who was a doctor and presumably knowledgeable of the Chinese materia medica. And he's the man, this man here, second from the left. Wilson considered them, and I quote, all faithful and true, and also of honest character. And were it not for their assistance, he very possibly would have died in September 1910 after his leg was crushed in an avalanche south of Songpan. They carried him to medical treatment in Chengdu and then returned to the field, gathering plant material that had been tagged earlier in the season and lily bulbs for him while he recovered in hospital. He didn't record any of the men's names, but Professor Yin Kai-pu of the Chengdu Institute of Biology, in his Wilson rephotography project, has traced some of their descendants and determined that the bearded man third from the right, and that's that gentleman there, his name was Wang Tianguan, and Wilson identifies him as a farmer. And the man fourth from the right, this younger man here, had a family name of Yin. And Wilson identifies him as a townsman of Yichang. That avalanche that incapacitated Wilson and ended his Chinese explorations, but Sargent had sent another young Englishman named William Purdom to the field there in 1909. Purdom embarked in February of that year to collect plants from areas with weather more severe than that of New England. He was first sent to the edges of Mongolia, to an area that Sargent was convinced, he was absolutely convinced, that there would be a good variety of trees. Well, unfortunately, the region had been deforested and there was almost nothing. And next he went to Shanxi and Gansu, where he had more success. And although he made fewer collections than Wilson, in 1910 he collected a new rhododendron in Shanxi province, which in 1913 was named Rhododendron prudhomii, after him by Alfred Rader and Ernest Wilson. During his trip, Purdom took nearly 200 photos, and he was interested in the anthropological and ethnographic aspects of the regions that he visited, and took many photos of people that he encountered, documenting their dress and their hairstyles. In this slide, we see Purdom on the left there in Chinese clothing, and a portrait of two children, and then also a young woman, both from Gansu. And I love the portrait of the children. I think it's very tender. And Frank Meyer, in 1904, David Fairchild of the USDA's Foreign Plant Introduction section hired Meyer to collect economic plants in China. When Meyer sailed for Asia in 1905, he began a 13-year campaign in 4 expeditions that led to the introduction of more than 2,000 species of plants. In an arrangement between Charles Sargent and Fairchild, Meyer sent the Arboretum trees and shrubs of ornamental value. Meyer was a prolific photographer of the minutiae of daily life. And with his snapshot camera, he captured laborers at their work, bamboo furniture, boatmen hauling lines, a giant cake made of jujubes, and hundreds of more of images. In contrast to Ernest Wilson's grand and highly composed photographs, Meyer's are very much of the moment. And because he was primarily collecting economic plants, and those are the sorts of plants used for food or for industry, he was meticulous in explaining what activity was going on in the image. So we have clockwise from the upper left our bamboo products for sale in a market in Shanghai in 1908. Men near Hangzhou pumping water into a rice paddy in June 1906. That great big jujube cake being served up in Beijing in April 1915. Small boats laden with vegetables in Shanghai in August of 1915. And to the right, there's Meyer in June 1914 in Meijian, Shanxi. The jujube cake, he says, for 2 or 3 coppers, get you a nice fat slice. And then Joseph Rock, that I had mentioned earlier. So Meyer died in 1918 in China, and Wilson returned from Japan after a trip there from 1917 to 1919 to Eastern Asia. After that time, the Arboretum didn't have a collector in Asia until botanist, anthropologist, explorer, linguist, and author Joseph Rock was hired to explore Western China and Eastern Tibet. He was tasked with collecting plants and photographing specimens along the Yellow River, the Amnimachan and Chilan mountain ranges, and he also collected along the Yangtze River, the Gansu-Sichuan border country, and around Kokonor Lake in Qinghai province. He collected 20,000 herbarium specimens and many packages of propagative material. And although few new species were found, he achieved Sargent's principal objective, which was to collect hardier forms of species that had already been collected by others, a practice that we still continue to do today. In the slide, we see clockwise from the upper right, Rock's Camp with those Abercrombie and Fitch tents. That's when Abercrombie and Fitch was an outfitter for explorers and such things, not just fashionable clothing, taken in northwest Gansu in October 1925. And then we see a young man standing beside a dragon spruce in Daksho Canyon in Tibet in June 1926. And a medicine shop with wares and baskets in Zhongba, Sichuan in March 1925, and then Joseph Rock there on the right-hand side in a photo taken in Yunnan in 1922. So Sargent's death in 1927 curtailed our plant collecting in temperate Asia for many years, as did economic and political upheaval during the 1930s and 1940s. Our institutional focus changed to contract collecting in the tropics with the goal of collecting herbarium material. In 1947, the Arboretum funded an extremely important contract collection when we sent funds to Sensu Hu of the Fan Memorial Institute of Biology, who, with Wanchun Cheng of the National Central University in Nanjing, had just described the newly discovered dawn redwood, or Metasequoia glyptostroboides, a tree thought to have been extinct, but was discovered growing happily in a valley near Motochi in Hubei. Now, Hu had long ties with the Arboretum, and in the 1920s, he had studied with none other than John Jack and received a doctorate from Harvard in 1925. He then returned to China, and he became a pioneer of modern botanical study there. And today, he's revered for his leadership in that in the mid-20th century. Hu sent Metasequoia specimens to Arboretum director Elmer Drew Merrill, who, in return, sent a collecting stipend of $250 to Professor Cheng. Cheng sent an assistant to Hubei to collect seed and, for the Arboretum, and that assistant gathered about 1 kilogram of seed, which was shipped to Boston in 2 batches in December of that year. Now, to understand, seeds for Metasequoia are little teeny tiny seeds. They're about 1/4 of an inch across. And just imagine how much 1 kilo of that seed, it's a huge, huge amount of seed. So we took that seed and we distributed it out, to about 600 botanic gardens, arboreta, private estate owners, and others. And our greenhouse staff was busy as well, and we grew and planted out a large number of trees in several locations on the grounds. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the large specimen near Tomato Road and adjacent to the Honeywell building. It's accession 524-48 asterisk, capital A, and it grew from one of those tiny, tiny seeds that were collected in Hubei. In the slide, we see Professor Cheng leaning against the type tree of Metasequoia when he visited the valley in spring of 1948, and a slide from the Gresset expedition from later that year of the type tree in the valley. Unfortunately, our plant collecting in China, and really in Asia at large, was curtailed for a number of years after the Chinese Revolution in 1949. This also coincided with a general decline in the Arboretum's collecting of wild plant material for propagation for our living collections. It wasn't until the late 1970s that we returned to Asia when Stephen Spongberg and Richard Weaver explored Japan and Korea in 1977. The thawing of East-West relations around that time led to the joint Sino-American Botanical Expedition, or SABE, as we refer to it, in 1980, in which Steve Spongberg represented the Arboretum among the American collectors. Now, in the slide on the right, we see Weaver and Spongberg right there. There's Weaver, and there's Steve Spongberg with 2 Japanese colleagues walking in Japan. And on the left, we see the American members of the SABE expedition standing in front of that Metasequoia type tree again. You can see let's see, Steve Spong, there's Steve, Ted Dudley, Bruce Bartholomew, and Dave Buford there in the poncho in the back. So I will leave off here because with these two expeditions, we have entered the modern era of airplanes, long-distance phone calls, 35 millimeter color cameras, all paving the way for collecting in the 21st century. So I'll just say, Michael, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lisa. What a trip down memory lane. That's great. 151 years of plant exploration, and you did a wonderful job of summarizing 90% of it. So that's great. Well, as you talked about plant exploration then and now, as one of our Arboretum resident plant explorers, I'm going to talk about the now. And I'm going to talk about this very much through a personal lens. I'm going to highlight things that I've seen, I've experienced, I've tasted, I've smelled, I've witnessed, and through some 15 different expeditions, foreign and domestic. And I'll start, and these are experiences that began in 1999, my first trip to China. Can't believe how young I looked back then. I guess we all did it, almost 25 years ago. But that was my first expedition to Asia, and that was to collect Cercidophyllum japonicum, the cat surret tree. You never forget your first love from the plant world. So, but also, not long after I joined the Arboretum staff in 2008, we got back into the expedition planning and execution process, and that was to the upstate New York, the Adirondacks. I've had a half a dozen plus expeditions in China, including 3, 2015, 2016, 2017 to northern Sichuan near Songpan and Huanglong. The last international trip that I was on was in May of 2019. That was to Honshu, Japan. And then just last autumn, we had a 3-day trip to the Great Lakes to focus on a brand new species of St. John's wort, another species of St. John's wort, and the rarest species of birch in North America, Betula murrayana, which is shown in the lower left-hand corner. Also grabbed an oak along the way. So that's the most recent one. As Lisa was talking about the plant exploration of the past, if we were to summarize and synthesize that in a short quip, I usually describe it as discovering, quote unquote, discovering, because the plants were there in nature. They didn't need a name. They didn't need to be discovered. And they were also known to people living around those plants. So what we do say when we say discovering, sometimes in introducing new plants, it was from the perspective of maybe Western science, assigning them a name in Latin, understanding what that species was, what genus it belonged to, the family. And so usually I say from the Arboretum's perspective and some of its peers during the early period, discovering and introducing new plants with a focus on alpha diversity, thinking of particularly species diversity, and then also economic botany. And that was, from Sargent's perspective, trees that might have great utility in forestry, but then that's also economic botany in the form of ornamentals that would be of value to use in a managed landscape horticulture. But we know that the world has changed since the halcyon days of Rock and Wilson and even Steve Spongberg and Ted Dudley and Dick Weaver. We know the laws of unintended consequences. Raise your hand. No, please don't. If you grow a Japanese barberry in your yard, Phil Crotch, I know you've got one in your yard. We know that these were plants that were introduced. Arnold Arboretum did not introduce it, but we did promote the use of Japanese barberry because it could grow anywhere. And of course it does, to the point that it's now become naturalized throughout many spaces in New England as a non-native invasive organism. And that's changed the world and affected how we conduct and why we conduct plant exploration ventures. There's also the introduced insects that are affecting our natural and our managed landscapes. And we can think of emerald ash borer, an insect that was novel It was introduced in about 20 years ago to the central Midwest and around Michigan and Detroit, and we know that that has decimated fraxinus or ash trees in nature as well as our managed landscapes from throughout the Midwest to the East Coast and then getting out towards the Rockies. So that is changing our world. And we do know, sadly, that about 1 out of 3 tree species on Earth is threatened with extinction. And this is also something that is affecting our lens, or guiding our lens when it comes to plant exploration. Why do we go collect? For the purposes of documenting plants that are threatened with extinction and seeking ways to preserve them in nature as well as out of nature in a place like the Arnold Arboretum. And then, of course, we know there's that climate change thing. We know that while on average our average temperatures in the winter and our summer temperatures in Boston and elsewhere are getting warmer, it's also idiosyncratic. This past winter we had one of the coldest temperatures, minus 11.49 in the weather station right outside this building, one of the coldest temperatures that we had had in some 50, 70 years. It's not easy being green, as our friend Kermit the Frog would say. But all those things kind of amalgamated together guide our plant exploration efforts here at the Arnold Arboretum. And I think about it as, through a lens of responsible collection of plant biodiversity in response to this changing world. And there are a number of things that I always consider when I'm out there on a plant exploration venture, and that's obviously documenting these plants and their habitats with an eye towards conservation. How do we preserve those plants in nature as we collect germplasm, the seeds, the cuttings, and bring those back to the Arnold Arboretum? How do we best preserve them here in this ark, this tree zoo, so to speak, where we can grow them. We can grow them for our own purposes, but also grow them so that scholars from around the world can come here and study them. So it's the research component. It's sharing the plant material, like Lisa was talking about, those 600 different packets of Dawn redwood seed that were sent out around the globe, sharing the seeds and the plants, but also sharing the stories, much like Lisa and I are doing now in print, in lecture format. And it's also inspiring people to become better citizens, to take note of the plants around them, and to care for the rare, as we might want to say. And so some examples of some of my expeditions that have focused on elements of this. 2015, we had a 2.5-week expedition, 2.5-week total expedition, in contrast to what Lisa was talking about from some of those multi-year campaigns that past explorers had in Asia. This is about 2.5 weeks in central China to focus on Acer griseum, the paperbark maple, a plant that is common in managed landscapes. It's a beautiful ornamental plant. It's not going to go extinct because it's well cultivated, but it only has about a dozen different populations left in nature, and we visited majority of those on that trip to document the natural habitat, to collect seed, and as well as to collect herbarium vouchers and DNA vouchers. But we've also had fun with other types of quests. In 2012, colleague Tony Aiello from the Morris Arboretum at the time were interested in hardy live oak, Quercus virginiana. Here's a postcard from our archive showing just how stately and beautiful those trees can be in climates not like Boston. This is the native range of Quercus virginiana, and you can see it dominates the Gulf Coast. And then it has that very skinny little bit of range that sneaks all the way up through the Carolinas into Virginia, and to the point, the tippity top of that range in the far northernmost part of the range, where you get to Richmond and Hampton, Williamsburg. As we would assume, plants from the northernmost parts of the range are going to experience colder winters, and they might have genes that will allow them to tolerate cold winters, maybe even those like Boston. And if you look, record temperatures over the last century and a half, Richmond, minus 11 Fahrenheit, Williamsburg, minus 7 Fahrenheit. So, that's approaching what we have here. So we had an expedition to collect acorns from those populations and cultivate them way up here in the north. And guess what? They're alive. Real quick, what do we collect? The Arnold Arboretum is a traditional arboretum. We focus on woody plants. We focus on temperate woody plants. We're not growing plants under glass, at least not in the long term, maybe just as wee seedlings. but we focus on temperate woody plants and a diversity of them. So we have, over 2,000 different species representing about 115 different plant families. And again, because these are a majority of woody plants, that's a pretty impressive set of numbers across the 16,000 trees, shrubs, and vines that we have in cultivation. I mentioned about 60, a focus on the temperate world. We have plants that are collected from right now outside these windows and these doors in the collections, plants hailing from 60 different countries. But a majority of them, 90%, come from just 5 or really 6 countries. The United States, China, Japan, both of the Koreas combined. The reason I combined them is some of those early collections. The notes perhaps from Ernest Wilson were good, but maybe not good enough to see just which side of the now DMZ they were on collected, or he noted they're collected now in what is known as North Korea. So for the purposes of here, I just lumped them all together. And then, of course, Canada. But 90% come from just those 5 or 6 countries. I think about where I've personally collected plants, and again, it's that band, that narrow, temperate band, and again, dominating on the eastern edge of these continental land masses, and those are where our temperate environments are. Unlike on the eastern or the western side, where you might find Mediterranean or maritime climates. And so those are dots on the map. Actually, I need to add 2022 collecting trip to this slide. I need to update that. But these represent areas where I've had the luxury to be able to collect. So I'd like to step through quick. What is field work like? Here's my colleague Andrew Kopinski, our director of horticulture, and I in 2017 in near Pingwu, Sichuan, and it starts by getting out in the field. Now we know we're going to pick an area where we know these certain plants are going to grow. We might have consulted floras or research papers or herbaria, different vouchers that have shown where past plants have been found, and we'll return to those areas in order to collect targeted species. But a lot of times, I say these rarely does X mark the spot. You might get you into the ball game, but it's not going to take you right to the seat in the stadium. And so it's a lot of wandering around, noting what is there, getting the right elevation and the right habitat, making note of what you're seeing. Sometimes finding wonderful rare beaches like the Engler Beach, finding them devoid of seed, so you still might make a point to collect as herbarium vouchers or DNA vouchers, and photographs, even if you don't have seed. But sometimes you get lucky and you find them in fruit, like that Schisandra on the right with Andrew in the backdrop. That's a vine. So we certainly collected those fleshy fruits of the Schisandra. And on the opposite side, we have a Deutzia longifolia. That plant was simultaneously in September here, in flower and in fruit. So we were able to collect flowering herbarium vouchers and fruiting ones, and of course the fruit themselves from which we could extract the seed. Sometimes we just see one plant there and we are only able to collect from a single maternal individual, but our goal is to maximize the genetic diversity, so we'll collect from many plants. This is a Hypericum calmianum in southwest Michigan from last autumn. And so from this one population, we collected from about 45 different individual plants. And each plant had, you can see at the tippity top there, these chartreusey green fruits that were still quasi-fleshy, but they dry up well and you can just open up and extract the seeds with relative ease. And I'm putting them in just a glassine envelope, and you can see I've got my Sharpie I'm marking down. It looks like I've got about 10, so that must be number 11, or maybe that's number 10. But we'll try to maximize the genetic diversity and collect from many different mother plants. And that's true for trees as well. An ash conservation project that I collaborated on with folks from the USDA and the Brenton Arboretum in 2011. We were, again, collecting at the population level, but collecting from knee-high shrubs is a little different from collecting 30 or 40 foot tall trees. But here's an American ash in Randolph, New York, just dripping with seed. That is not autumn leaf color. That is autumn seed set. And each of those seeds are loaded. We would cut down a branch or cut off a branch with a pocket chainsaw and extract the seeds, pile them up in paper bags till we get several thousand seeds from each maternal line, and then this would represent part of a population. So looked like there are 7 this is a different population, but 7 individual mother trees in that, or no, well, it looks like 5 there, but 5 maternal trees in that modified map case that we had in the back of a USDA minivan that we'd plug into we had a little space heater dryer that you could plug into the cigarette outlet to wick away and dry the moisture from these seeds, so we didn't want them to rot. So that was pretty easy collecting. Sometimes it's not as easy. This is from that paperbark maple collecting trip. This is in Guangmushan in northeastern Sichuan. We were collecting the paperbark maple, hiking around, trying to find the trees, measuring them. This is the colleague Chris Bachtel from the Morton Arboretum. We had looked down trails, very mountainous, as the previous image showed, and you could see, because they stand out like red needles in green haystacks, we could see the paperbark maple. So we scooted down a steep slope and about 40 or 50 feet to see this tree, and of course it was pretty high up. We weren't going to climb it. It was very difficult to climb, but luckily we have this thing called a pocket chainsaw. We throw a rope over a branch, bring the other, or a line, tie part of that line to basically a chainsaw blade, bring it back around that branch, scissor it back and forth, and voila, the branch falls, and you've got a happy plant explorer there to have the material. Of course, then we package everything up. We got back up on the trail and went about 15 minutes and looked back to where we had collected, and we were basically about 15 feet from that cliff. And so sometimes, there's all sorts of different surprises. This is looking down from the parking area in this park. So it's always an adventure. Sometimes you find trees that have, loaded with fruit. And many a collector has an inability to, they don't have the ability to say no. They want to just see the seed. You've got to collect. Baling hay, if you will, because if it's got seed on it, you want to just collect it, even if you might have 25 of them already at the Arboretum. We practice restraint. Just because it has seed doesn't mean you need to collect it. It's not a numbers game. In the early days of the Arboretum, when it was basically a blank slate here, everything was new under the sun. And so certainly, if you saw an Acer Davidii, you would collect it. Now we have to be a little more conservative and discriminate on what's important for us to collect. So every time I've seen an Acer Davidii, I don't care what day of the year it is, it seems to be full of seed. So we always just take a photograph, maybe a voucher, but never collect the seed. We're not just collecting the germplasm, the seeds, though. We're also collecting lots of notes about the plants. A little old-fashioned here. I use still a notebook with a pre-printed template of the types of data that we're interested in. I print this on Write in the Rain or waterproof paper, and many a torrential downpour we've been out in collecting and used a Write in the Rain notebook. I don't think a laptop or a tablet would work very well when it's raining cats and dogs. So collect all the data here. This one was from a trip to Japan, and so we'll translate. If it's an international trip, we'll have it in Chinese or Japanese. Which is helpful when we're working with some of our colleagues, describing the plant, describing the habitat, latitude, longitude. I often have lots of shorthand notes because later on that night, I'll be collecting it. We all have different roles. Persons gathering the seed, persons gathering the herbarium specimens, the data, and then at night we're putting that into a computer. Or sometimes, that day if you're riding in the car and it's a little boring drive, break out your laptop. And then those all go into our databases. In addition to the documentation, another very important thing, just like what Lisa was talking about, are the photographs. On the left, we have a photograph that Wilson took in August of 1910, just about 2.5 weeks before he was involved in that landslide where he broke his leg. This is in Pingwu, northern Sichuan, and he came upon a Cercidophyllum japonicum, what he thought was going to be a different species, perhaps even, Cercidophyllum sinense or Japonicum sinense. But he saw this huge tree and photographed it with 3 of his collectors. And what's amazing is that exact tree is still alive. And so in 2017, Andrew Kopinski and I and our colleague Kong Wong, shown there in the red, visited that very same tree. The tree is actually much larger than it was in 1910. We rephotographed it, vouchered it with herbarium vouchers, the DNA vouchers, and of course collected seed. And we have trees of this from this growing now in the Arboretum. So it's wonderful. In addition to the photo documentation, I talked about these herbarium vouchers. What is that? On the left, there's me collecting a voucher in 2010, of a hydrangea longipiece. Pretty stout, large leaves, about the size of a plate. But then we would put those in between newsprint to press them down so that you can preserve a piece of that plant in perpetuity once they get mounted onto stiff paper. And on the right, you can see a herbarium voucher actually from this tree. So this is the tree on the left and on the right, the same tree. Here is a voucher that Wilson took. And this is in our herbarium in Cambridge 120 years later, or 110 years later. Still preserved. You can still see all the fruits and the leaves, both the upper side and the underside, and of course Wilson's notes and annotations. So we're collecting these herbarium vouchers for science. We're also collecting DNA. So these are leaves of paperbark maple that we'll put in tea bags and then put those bags into Ziploc bags that have silica gel that wick out all the moisture. Now we've been spending all the time collecting the seed, but and the fruits, they need a lot of preparation. Usually for every 2 days in the field, we budget 1 additional day for seed preparation. It's 2 to 1. And so you can never have enough time to clean seed. We're doing it in the evenings anyway, but then sometimes we'll take a whole day just to dry the seed, extract the fruit, the seed from the fruit. Sometimes, like when we were in Utsunomiya, Japan, working with a professor, he has this wonderful laboratory, and we've got all the space and seed drying equipment and these bins where we can just put out the seeds, let them dry down, or the fruits, so that maybe it's a capsule and it needs to dry enough so that it can open up and you can extract the seeds, or maybe they drop out themselves. Sometimes they might be fleshy, like this Ilex, there's a holly here, Ilex geniculata, and so that one, using sieves and forceps to extract that little seed from that fleshy berry. That's what Keiko is doing in the right-hand side as well, preparing some dried seeds. We're also using the time to inspect. This is a viburnum rightii, and in the upper left-hand corner you can see what we started with, but I worked through this to pull out any seeds that might have been infested by an insect. And so if you look closely, you can see this pinhole prick, little hole on those seeds. So I went through each and every one of those seeds, inspected it to make sure it was devoid of any insects, because I do not want to be responsible, neither does the Arnold Arboretum, want to be responsible for introducing the next Asian longhorn beetle or emerald ash borer. Sometimes we might just be doing it, outside. This is from 2010 in kind of a rustic hotel that we're staying at. All of our fruits drying, and everybody, graduate students, other folks from the Beijing Garden, even the drivers out there enjoying the process of cleaning seed, using winnowing to separate wheat from chaff. This is Kong. He's very good. This works great for ash and maple seeds. Sometimes we'll be doing it in our hotel too, if we're lucky, where it might have air conditioning and we can drop the relative humidity. And sometimes, this is Andrew, the night before we're leaving, practically, he'll still cleaning with headlamps, trying to get seed out of, I think this was a larch. But eventually it's all spotless, it's clean, all in their individual Ziploc bags and packaged up with the individual collection numbers and ready to be shipped off when we're on an international trip. We bundle them up and we ship them directly to a USDA, an APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service station, where then they will re-inspect everything and make sure it passes muster before it comes to us. But right before we leave, we make sure that we're also inspecting our herbarium samples. So Shibano and I are working through those. This is in Japan. Cleaning them up, making sure they're also ready to be brought back to the United States. Sorting them out, making sure the numbers match, making sure the quantities are there. we get back, and usually about 2 weeks after we return from an international trip, the seeds arrive. And here they are in the Dana greenhouse, post-inspection and ready to be put into their different propagation recipes and rituals. Getting around, as Lisa was mentioning, sometimes those expeditions were 2 to 3 years. Generally, our international trips are 2 to 3 weeks. The longest one that I was on was about 4.5 weeks. So getting there, it's 12, 15, 14 hours, and so it's a lot faster than taking the Bismarck or the other ships. The Doric, yes, thank you, the Doric. Gosh, that thing looked like something out of anyway. Getting there is half the fun. So certainly we're in automobiles, a lot different from Joseph Rock there or Wilson. The images you saw before. Usually we've got 1 or 2 SUVs or minivans packed to the gills. It's a game of Tetris, figuring out how to, all of our different supplies, carrying water, particularly in China. We'll bring our own bottled water. There's not a lot of room to sit and maneuver, but we make it work. We have these wonderful little devices called cell phones. This is on the Acer Gricium trip. We actually had latitude and longitude of where those different populations were. We could plug those into the GPS, and then, there we go. Of course, very mountainous terrain, so you can see the zig and the zag and the zag and the zig and the up and the down on that GPS, directing us where to go. But very, very quick grid road system for the most part in China, likewise in Japan and elsewhere. But sometimes you get off the beaten path and you go down, a ways and half hour, there's no turning spots, and then all of a sudden you find 2 other cars coming back at you. It's always a bit of an adventure, and we've seen that in the Ozarks as well. How to deal with flat tires, and sometimes we just hoof it, just like Wilson. I never lost that much weight. I do come back on a trip much lighter than I went there, but never lost that much weight. Hiking up the roads and making our way. And sometimes we resort to the horse if we have to. Certainly I've had the adventures, dealing with landslides in China. It's a very dynamic landscape, very seismic landscape. And so we did not drive over this. We parked the car 3 or 4 hours away and then hiked in through here. But these were recent earthquakes and then landslides. Certainly typhoons we've enjoyed typhoons in Japan. Incredibly wet days where the boots never ever get dry. Enjoyed the wildlife, like we can see here. I'm always the one I have the snake phobia, and I'm always the person who finds the cottonmouth, like on the upper right-hand corner, or the pygmy rattler in the lower side, or the mamushi, Glodius blumhoffii there in Japan. Everybody walked right by it, and I'm like, they're practically stepping on it. They're looking for plants, I'm looking for snakes. Not because I'm into them. And of course, beloved land leeches. But we sustain ourselves by great food. Some of the best barbecue ever in Buzz and Ned's down in Virginia. I love Asian cuisine and some of the best meals ever. This is up in our ranger station where we were staying in a panda reserve in northern Sichuan. And sometimes we have the luxury of a Lazy Susan. We didn't in this case, but we're all great community building and great food, all of us American and Chinese friends alike. And sometimes we'll have the luxury of being able to pack a lunch or having it packed for us. And here we had, the chicken leg wasn't necessarily done. It was okay, but it was lots of fresh fruit and eggs, lots of hard-boiled eggs, which I enjoy. My colleague Tony Aiello does not enjoy hard-boiled eggs, so I always get double because he doesn't eat his. Noodles, I've eaten many noodles. My trip in 1999 in Xi'an, China, I went to this very same noodle place, and every time in Xi'an, I always go back. The best dry noodles ever, spicy noodles, very, very spicy noodles. Anyway, noodles. Sometimes by the end of it, you're a little tired of noodles, but anyway, noodles. Noodles sustain us. The food sustains us, but it's also the people. These are my colleagues, Jeff Karstens on the left and Andy Schmitz on the right on our ash collecting trip. Those are some of the fruits of our labor, and again, collecting at the population level. And this was really important because these populations of ash do not exist anymore in northern Pennsylvania and southern New York. These are where all of your Louisville sluggers come from. These ash trees do not exist, or they they exist as mooncast shadows to what they once were. So we were very thrilled to be able to collect and bank all of the seed from this population, from these populations. Same thing working with, on international trips, we're with local experts. The gentleman on the right is Professor Miniaki Aizawa. He's a professor at Utsunomiya University, and is a graduate student on the far left, Tatsuhiko Shibano. So they call themselves forest botanists, which I love that term. They know the botany of the forest. And of course, then Tony Aiello next to me, and Steve Schneider, who used to work at the Arboretum, and Todd Ronzaville, who was then at the Poly Hill Arboretum. So we always band together, international and our colleagues from international destinations as well as local destinations to collect because we're jointly interested in these ventures. And even sometimes we have firsts. So this was on our Acer Griseum collecting trip, and the gentleman in the very foreground, Chris Bachtel, this was his very first selfie that he ever took. So he was very proud, and it was the largest Acer Griseum any of us had ever seen, over 1 meter in width. And just rounding it out, certainly the adventure, the food sustains us, the sights sustain us, the people sustain us, but also the plants. And I just love when we get to go and collect in nature, collect the seed, bring them back to the Arboretum, coax them to germinate, watch them grow in the greenhouse, watch them get planted out into the nurseries, dig them up and plant them out. And there's nothing more rewarding than these are 3 bald cypress, Taxodium disticum, that were collected in 2014 in the Ozarks, now planted out in Kentfield in the conifer collection, approaching their fall glory of autumn leaf color. And it's so rewarding, bringing a little bit of the Ozarks here to our conifer collection. So with that, I'll just thank you for your attention. I think Lisa and I are going to sidle up here to the lazy boys, the easy chairs, and take some questions that you might have. Do you want the right side or the left side?
Oh, your choice.
And one thing we will ask is that because we do have an online audience, and so it'll be very important. We have microphones for any of the folks in residence here that we'd like you to use, so the online folks can hear your question, and then I might repeat them as well. So Anna's got the microphone, and so if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait till you get the microphone before you ask it. So any questions from the audience?
Yes.
Got a gentleman back there.
Yeah, for Michael, you mentioned DNA vouchers as opposed to herbarium vouchers. So I always thought that the herbarium vouchers, maybe from the past, were used for DNA research possibly, but it sounds like there's a specific task of collecting DNA vouchers. So just comment more on that, please.
That's a great question. And so it's the distinction between a traditional herbarium voucher, which would be a branch that ideally has flowering and fruiting features, leaf features that preserve kind of the macromorphology of what that plant looks like, stuck onto stiff paper that would be filed in an herbarium cabinet. And you can extract DNA from the vegetated material. It's going to be generally lower quality DNA. The drying process isn't as quick, and there might be a lot of mess in order to clean out in order to purify that DNA. The preferred method that we use now, though, is that we'll get fresh leaf material and dry it very quickly in the silica sand or silica beads. And so that will preserve the integrity of the DNA, and then it makes it easier to take those pieces of leaf and then take it into the laboratory and quickly extract the DNA. It's going to be just higher quality. So and we'll do both. We'll have those little leaves that we're putting in those tea bags. Those will go into the silica gel and be dried down instantly, and then saved for later use for extraction of DNA. And then the voucher, then you don't have to damage the voucher. You don't have to extract anything off that voucher. The leaves that are on the voucher, the herbarium voucher, are preserved. Anna, there's a question up front. No, it's okay. This lady here. Yep.
I garden at the Wakefield Estate, and we've done DNA. DNA was done there to find out some of the dogwoods that are also here, and which was so exciting, but so expensive. And I'm wondering how much have you done DNA here to find things out? And I'm also wondering why you collected like 7 whole bags of the same plant.
Right. So 2 different questions there. One is with the DNA work. I haven't extracted DNA in probably 15 years personally. So, but it's many a scientist in this building will extract DNA, and then we've got scholars from around the world that will come here to the Arboretum to grab the leaves and extract. And it's generally a relatively painless activity. It just takes the time to do it in the lab and work through the recipe. The younger the leaf, the easier it is to extract the DNA. The integrity of the DNA is far better, and there's more DNA relative to other things that might be in the sample. But it happens. It's very routine. It just depends on also the questions you're asking. Why do you need to have the DNA to answer the question? And so oftentimes people will use it to either ascertain the identity of that species, or maybe it's a hybrid, and so you can look to see if it's a hybrid between 2 different ones, or to see how unique it might be. And so that leads into some of the questions we were doing from all those paperbark maples. We were collecting DNA vouchers from the different populations to see how similar or dissimilar the populations are, to see if they could be lumped or kept separate. The second question you had was about the sheer magnitude of that ash seed. So again, for those purposes, that was to reconstruct. The goal is maybe in 50 or 60 years, or maybe even sooner, we'll be able to rebuild entire populations of ash trees in areas that had been eradicated by emerald ash borer. So you don't just want to have one seed from one mother plant. Genetic diversity is very important, and so we wanted to maximize the amount of genetic diversity. Lots of mothers and lots of individual children from each mother. And the interesting thing is because ash trees have both male and female trees, we knew that we had lots and lots of fathers because it's wind pollinated. We had pollen from many, many fathers from around the world. So those are pretty genetically diverse samples. Great question, though.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, with regards to the collected samples that were from the earlier campaigns, has there been any really decimating problems that you've had to kind of deal with in the Arboretum? And a second but unrelated question would be, what are each of your favorite specimens, either living or dead, in the Arnold Arboretum? Thank you.
Problems. Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there were many things that were collected. I can think of some of the cherry trees that Wilson had collected. These are cultigens. They'd be called cultivars now, but in Japan, the 19-teens. And many of those were growing here at the Arboretum. Beautiful, lot of variety of flowers, and they were wiped out in the cold freezes of 1932 and 1933. Or was
No,
30,
actually, 1933 and 34.
33 and 34.
Yes.
So sometimes
Terribly
the fruits of your labor only last a few decades. They get frosted out. I mean, that I know was decimating in that sense. So that would probably be one among many examples.
Yeah, exactly. So so our favorites. So one of my favorites, because of course there are 16,000 plants on the grounds, but one of my favorites are our hardy cedars of Lebanon, because of the story Michael told about finding plants at the northern or the upper reaches of their range. Of course, cedar of Lebanon grows in Lebanon where it's hot, and Sargent decided that he wanted to see. He had heard about hardy cedars of Lebanon that were growing up in the mountains in Turkey, and he had a collector, a contracted collection, and that man went. He gathered seed. The seed was brought back, and it would grow here in the climate in the said West Roxbury, which is the way our charter reads. So that's something that I
I get
like
that
in
question
particular.
often, and it's difficult for me to
boy.
answer that one. It's like asking a grandmother who her favorite grandchild is. She might have one, but she's not going to tell you.
Yeah.
So it varies. It varies. I think one of my favorites happens to be a Hurricane birch that's up on the up on Bussey Hill, and it's a 100-year-old specimen. It has this branch that defies gravity, and it's much like our river birch. It just has very shaggy, craggy bark. There's something about that individual specimen that every time I'm up on Bussey Hill, I have to go take a look at and pat it on the side and say, "How you doing?" But it changes every day, I think.
Yeah,
That's a great question.
it is.
And I hope everybody in this room has a favorite in our collection.
We have a question from the online audience for Lisa.
Oh, okay.
Do you still have the glass negatives that Wilson carried?
Oh, we most certainly do. Yes, and they're in really quite good condition, and they have weathered these. First of all, being carried over hill and dale all across China and Japan and Korea, but then sent back. All of Wilson's Chinese photographs were shipped. The plates, the exposed plates, were shipped back to England, where they were developed by a man named E.J. Wallace at Kew, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and then they were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean and back to us here. Wilson's photos for his 1914 trip to Japan were actually developed in Japan, and then the developed plates were sent back to the Arboretum, and likewise for his 1917 to 1919 trip to Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. He had them developed in Japan and then sent back here to Boston to the Arboretum. But yes, the plates, they live happily in the library in a little alcove and in filing cabinets. We have been advised by Harvard curators from the Weizmann Preservation Center that, it's an okay way to store them. Perhaps at some point we might want to think about something else, but they're in little enclosed containers in the filing cabinet drawers, and they're safe and healthy there, and they're in fantastic condition. And we've been fortunate to digitize all of them as part of a grant project that we did some years ago. So they're online, and you can see them on Hollis Images. So I encourage you to do that.
Oh, thank you. Hi. I noticed your expeditions tended to be in Asia and the United States, and I'm just wondering, are there temperate regions in the southern hemisphere you might go to?
Lorna, that's a great question. The odd thing is that land masses on Earth tend to be in the northern hemisphere, and all the continental climates, technically, there's a taxonomy to all things. There's a taxonomy to climates. It's called the Köppen classification system. Basically, all of the continental climates are north of the equator. And a continental climate meaning that it's going to have very hot summers, very cold winters, and some seasonality with respect to the moisture and when it arrives. And so when we do matchmaking, so to speak, we find climates that are similar to ours here. That being said, there are a couple spots in South America, basically like primarily in Argentina, that have close temperate climates where you've got the hot and the cold. And there are a couple taxa, monkey puzzle trees, as well as a Nothofagus, a southern beech dombii that grow there. And so we do have a few things that we've targeted for future collection there, with hopes that they will survive Boston's winters and summers. And then the other thing is winter wet. We were having a conversation about this earlier. A lot of the plants from the southern hemisphere might be cold hardy, and they might even be able to tolerate the hot summers, but they don't like to sit there. Their roots don't like to sit there in mud season, which we tend to have a lot of here in Boston. They need to have transpiring leaves. They need to have leaves that are functional, photosynthesizing, and wicking away through the art and science of transpiration that moisture away from the roots. And so that's why a lot of the plants tend to perish from those parts of the world that we grow here. But north of the equator, we've had recent expeditions. I haven't participated on them, but we had some in the Republic of Georgia a couple of years ago, 2 expeditions there. We certainly grow a lot of material from Turkey. Has been much of it has done well for us here. There's less biodiversity in Europe, relative to the United States or China, and so there are just fewer plants that we need to collect and target. But there are a few.
Oh, a couple questions over here.
Anna, you're getting your steps in today to get back and forth.
Hello, I was curious to know what kind of soil you plant the seeds in, because they must come from a different background than what you have here, the Arboretum. And how do you consider what to do about them?
That's a fantastic question about, so we bring these precious little seeds back to the Arboretum, we bring them into the Dana greenhouse. What types of soils do we grow them in? Our wonderful team of propagators and plant producers at the Dana greenhouse have index cards, which also have been digitized with the recipes for what works. And so there are different mixes that they'll use, trying to match make so they make sure they've got the right amount of moisture. But generally it's a soilless mix, no actual soil, no mineral component. Sometimes these might have a lot of some vermiculite, some perlite, some pine bark. But there are some ways, some plants will be fine in that. Other times, if it's like rhododendrons, sometimes they might have a mycorrhizal associate or an associate with a fungus. And so sometimes you want to introduce that, maybe with a little bit of what we call mineral soil or field soil. So there are different recipes that we'll try in order to best coax that seed to germinate and then thrive in that environment. But we aren't collecting native soil from China or Japan or Korea. Das ist verboten. Soil cannot be brought in for good reasons, because a lot of pests and pathogens can hitchhike. Again, we don't want to be responsible for bringing in anything toxic.
So I had a question about herbaceous plants. So obviously the focus of the Arboretum is woody plants, but I'd imagine expeditions going back, especially some of the older expeditions, is a huge undertaking, a lot of organizing. I would assume that there's people collecting herbaceous plants as well. So I'd just be curious as how that gets lumped into collecting experiences.
A great question. I mean, like I mentioned, we're a traditional arboretum, and where we focus on the ligneous, or they used to call it the ligneous flora, temperate floras. What's interesting is that in Wilson's expeditions for the Arnold Arboretum, the quality material that would be collected and then accessioned here at the Arnold Arboretum was exclusively woody. However, Professor Charles Sprague Sargent needed to fund his expeditions, and so he had subscriptions from people, including like Ellen Wilmot himself, Farquhar, who had one of the most important nurseries in the area, and they would acquire herbaceous material. Wilson would acquire herbaceous material that then would just not be grown here at the Arboretum, but would then be sold back as a lot. So like the lily bulbs that Wilson collected, particularly the regal lily, that he collected multiple times. Those were, thousands of lily bulbs that were collected in nature. We would not do that now, but surely to fund the expedition. So those early expeditions, if they collected herbaceous material, it was basically just to fund the expedition. But never a single one of the 9,010 or so regal lilies that Wilson collected, not a single one was grown on Arboretum, in the Arboretum, except for at Wilson's house. It was not accessioned. Nowadays, though, we do collect some herbaceous material if it's of interest to us or our colleagues. If we're on a collecting expedition and it's a botanical garden that has an interest in both woody and non-woody things, of course we're going to collect some of the herbaceous material, and we might choose to accession it here. On that Ozark trip, we collected some blue star Amsonia hubrechtii, and which is drop dead gorgeous. We've got a pile of it in front of the Honeywell building, and it is some of the most beautiful fall color that you'll ever see in your life. So we now have about 2% of our accessions now are herbaceous, which is, Charles Sprague Sargent's probably rolling in his grave.
Well, no, he wouldn't have been, because, well, I don't know. We'll go over to Walnut Hill Cemetery and see. But Very early on, though, I'm thinking of the borders in about 5, 10 feet deep in some cases. In the very young Arboretum, we're talking the 1890s, Jackson Dawson, who was our propagator here, would rent a wagon and horse and go out, and he would dig native plant material, a lot up in Andover. His family lived up in Andover. He would bring that back, and it was planted along the borders of the road to give some visual interest when the trees in the Arboretum were very, very young. And so early on, we have some early photographs, and you see these deep borders of herbaceous material, and then, some kind of rather tiny little trees in the background that, then in another 15, 20 years had, grown up and were, big and lush. But in those very earliest days, there was more herbaceous material around here.
Hi. I'm curious to know, I don't know a lot about invasive species, but how do you at the Arboretum evaluate whether a plant species is going to become invasive? How many years does that take? How about the Japanese berberis that you showed? How many years did it take before it was determined to be invasive?
Right. It's a fantastic question about how long does it take to know if a plant's going to become invasive. Woody plants take a long time to show their cards or their true colors. Herbaceous plants, on the other hand, can rapidly tell you if they're going to be precocious and fecund. So what we will do is, there are a number of different things. Sometimes if you know you're in a genus like berberis, rhamnus, Lonicera, some of the things that we know already are bad actors in this environment, we already know, or we can anticipate that plant will become a problem. And so it might be something that we will avoid collecting, or maybe something that we are culling or minimizing the amount of plants that are here in the Arboretum. Other cases, you don't know. I think of...
I think Sargent had high hopes for Ailanthus. And, we know what Tree of Heaven is like these days. He thought, it might be a very good timber tree.
Right.
Well, that didn't happen.
Yeah. and so there are wonderful decision trees and matrices that folks have developed, scientists have developed to say, well, is it bird dispersed or wind dispersed? There are different ways of kind of predicting the potential for an organism to invade, and so we've put some of those to test and to anticipate what would be a problem. But there are some plants that what's interesting is plants that might be threatened with extinction in nature that might be perfectly happy here. And so we've made judgment calls on things in order to cultivate it here in limited supply, so that, for conservation purposes. But it's not something that we're going to promote or grow with intent to distribute. We're not going to do that. Recommended as an ornamental. But we'll grow it here for conservation purposes.
Oh, that lovely Celastris.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. Sargent waxed and waned poetic about Japanese barberry. Oh my goodness, how much he loved how it blended with the native vegetation. And then 50, 60 years later, Donald Wyman was talking about the value of different species of bittersweet, Celastris, including one that had thorns on it.
Let's make it even worse than it is.
So we've learned, from past mistakes and the law of unintended consequences. Obviously, it was before anybody anticipated, this was going to become a problem. Same thing like kudzu or multiflora rose.
Yeah, exactly.
Is the flora of the New England area of interest to Asian arboretums, and has the Arnold Arboretum ever hosted expeditions from other countries?
Great question. In 2019, we had 3 of our colleagues from the Beijing Botanic Garden, Kunming Institute of Botany, and the Chengdu Institute of Biology that were on a 3-week expedition through the Appalachians. And that was one of the first where they were really keenly interested in collecting seeds to bring back to China to then grow in their own establishing botanic gardens. In years before that, there might not have been as many gardens established where they'd grow it, and so oftentimes the collections were for herbarium vouchers. But that was a wonderful trip in 2019. When I visited botanical gardens in Korea and in Japan and in China, I've seen majority of the plants that were grown within there were native to the country. There might be street trees growing outside of that that were, ash trees from here, Fraxinus pennsylvanica, growing in China as a street tree, but inside the botanical gardens, generally it was more of a celebration of the native flora. But we have Franklinia is something that's been very popular, and so pretty much every year we collect seed from our Franklinia trees. It's a tree that's extinct in nature. And so we'll ship those to colleagues in foreign countries, particularly in China, for them to grow in their gardens.
Oh, here comes Anna with the...
Is there any, interface between Harvard Medical and you folks, or between Big Pharma and you folks here at the Arboretum?
Over the last 25, 30 years, there have been a number of research labs, commercial or academic, interested in some of the plant materials that we've had here. There was a big push for a vine that's related to Celastrus, the ornamental bittersweet, called Tripterigian Wilfordii, and there seems to be some value there as a male birth control. And so there continues to be ongoing interest, so there were materials that were shipped there. We also had, probably about 15 years ago, there's a research scholar who had an appointment. He's a postdoctoral fellow at the Arnold Arboretum, based in the herbarium, but also doing some work at Harvard Medical School on some of the native plants in China, and looking at some of the natural products. So occasionally it does occur, but less so here.
What percentage are native from New England here?
The percentage of plants growing here at the Arnold Arboretum that are from New England? That's a question I don't have an answer to, but I would say that probably fewer than 3 or 4% were collected here. No, the species might occur here. Shagbark hickory grows here, but we might have a shagbark hickory from Lakeville, Indiana. So the species might occur here, and so then the numbers are going to be higher. But earlier, Jackson Dawson, that Lisa was talking about, our first employee, the first propagator, he collected near and far in New England, and so a lot of the early plants certainly were very local.
Yeah.
Just a non-scientific, local, yokel question. So it's the sergeant that's connected with the, or founded the Arboretum. Is he connected, or the owner of the Sargent estate on the Brookline side of?
Yes, that was originally Charles Sargent's estate, and the lake that is there, the pond that is there in the Sargent estates, that actually Sargent had that pond dug on his estate. His estate was called Holmlea, 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 and it was about 150 acres. So it was a very large estate, and he did quite a large amount of design of that landscape and work on that landscape there.
And Lisa, when was that subdivided into its current?
Yeah, so that was after his death. So Sargent died in 1927, and that property was divided up for home sites, I think probably in the 1930s. It was not that long after his death. I was going to say a little bit of the issue was he had been kind of grooming his son Andrew Robeson Sargent to follow in his footsteps, but sadly Andrew died young, young being in like his 40s, for example, and he didn't have a kind of successor and things. He had another son who was a banker in New York and had no interest in plants whatsoever. So there wasn't kind of anyone to continue on the Sargent estate and kind of business, if you will.
I heard that they leased the plot of land the buildings are on for 99 years.
Oh, at the Sargent Estates? Oh, to be honest, I don't know. I really don't know. I know we lease our land for a 1,000 year, I was going to say 999, but 1,000-year lease from the city of Boston, but for $1 a year. Oh, I think we have another question.
Just one more question. I want to know, Michael, are you planning to go back to Sichuan province? And one thing that your photos didn't really show was how rough the terrain is. Very rocky, very steep, high elevations. They do have a lot of really nicely built roads there, albeit with landslides, but you didn't really show many of the shots of rock with his entourage trying to get over these amazing rocks. So
Right.
when are you going back?
Great question about expeditions for this year. Right now, we're in the midst of planning some expeditions to East Asia. The hopes this year is that we'll have expeditions, we'll have plant material being collected in China, Japan, and Korea. We're in the process of figuring all that out right now. We have 3 wonderful institutions that are working with us in China. Whether we go and collect directly this autumn or we've got some contracted collections with some of their graduate students, we're working out those details. But then Miniaki Izawa, he is very eager to this will be his 4th expedition with us. Mm-hmm. He's fantastic. He and his current and former students are out there in the field with our list of plants, knowing where they are, and so that we can go and collect. And then we, just before the pandemic, we were entering into some wonderful relationships with the Korea National Arboretum to engage in a formal expedition. The last major one we had in Korea was 1977 with Dick Weaver and Steve Spongberg. So we're very eager to go back to Korea this autumn. So that's the hope. Great. Well, I think that's all the questions. Thank you, everybody in the room for attending, and then everybody online. I know we had several hundred people signed up online, so thank you for tuning in from the comfort of your living rooms. So thank you all.